Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 9 deeply unsettling stories from people who found themselves driving alone at night on empty highways, forgotten backroads, and roads that maybe shouldn't exist at all. These are accounts from people who turned the wrong corner, stopped for the wrong reason, or simply drove a little too far into the dark. Get comfortable, turn off the lights if you're feeling brave, and make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, let's get into it. Story 1. There's a stretch of highway in central Montana that runs about 40 miles without a single exit. No gas stations, no rest stops. Not even a gravel turnout where you could pull over if you needed to. Just 2 lanes and the dark pressing in from both sides. I know this road well, or I thought I did. I'd been driving it for 3 years running every October when I'd make the trip out to my uncle's property to help him winterize before the freeze set in. It was never a road I loved, but it was practical. Fastest route, no tolls, and I could usually make it in one shot on a single tank of coffee, and whatever country station came in clear enough to stay on. That particular year, this was 3 Octobers ago now, I left later than I meant to. I'd been dealing with a slow leak in my rear driver's side tire for 2 weeks and kept putting off getting it patched. By the time I loaded the truck and got everything squared away, it was already past 10. My uncle had left the porch light on. I had a gas station burrito from around 6 that was sitting heavy, and I remember thinking I should have grabbed something better before I hit the highway because there'd be nothing else until Garrison. The first 60 miles were fine. I had a podcast going, something about cold case archaeology, which is ironic now, and the drive felt normal. Comfortable, even the way a long, empty road can feel when you're not thinking too hard. Somewhere around mile marker 74, I noticed my headlights were doing something strange. Not flickering, not dimming, just seeming like they weren't reaching as far ahead as they usually did, like the dark was thicker than it should be. I figured maybe my eyes were tired. I turned off the podcast and cracked the window to wake myself up a little. That's when I saw the car. It was pulled halfway onto the narrow gravel strip at the road's edge, hazards going. An older sedan, dark-colored, maybe navy, maybe just dirty. I slowed down because that's what you do, right? You check if someone needs help. I pulled up behind it and sat for a second with my own hazards on, watching. No movement inside. I could see the back seat through my headlights and there was nothing in it, no bags, no jacket, nothing. The trunk appeared closed and undamaged. I thought maybe someone had gotten a flat and already been picked up and they just left the car. I sat there probably 3 minutes debating. I'm not someone who spooks easily. I grew up with 2 older brothers who made it their mission to cure me of any fear response before I was 12, so my first instinct is usually skepticism. I got out. The night air was colder than I'd expected for October and smelled like pine resin and wet clay. My boots were loud on the gravel. I walked up to the driver's side window and cupped my hands around my face to look inside. The front seat was empty. The keys were gone. But on the passenger seat, someone had laid out a row of small rocks, 7 or 8 of them in a perfectly straight line from the dashboard to the edge of the seat, like they'd been arranged deliberately. I stood there a moment longer than I should have, trying to figure out what kind of breakdown situation ends with that. I told myself it was nothing. Kids maybe, or someone with a habit I didn't understand. I walked back to my truck. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Not fast. Not charging, just steady, deliberate footsteps in the gravel that I could clearly hear over the sound of my own breathing. I turned around. Standing about 30 feet back down the road between my truck and where the darkness began was a person, or something shaped like a person. Tall, wearing what looked like a pale windbreaker, standing absolutely still. No movement at all. I hadn't heard them approach. There was no other vehicle. They were simply there, occupying space they hadn't occupied 30 seconds before. "Hey," I said like an idiot. You need help?" Nothing, no response, no shift in posture, no acknowledgement that I'd spoken. I had my keys in my hand already, and I was doing the mental math on the distance to my truck door when the figure tilted its head, not the way a person turns to hear you better. Tilted all the way smoothly until its head was nearly level with its shoulder, then kept going past that. I was in my truck before I knew I'd moved. Engine on. I pulled around the abandoned car without fully stopping and got back on the highway and drove. I watched the mirror for a full mile before I stopped watching. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. But when I stopped at a gas station in Garrison, I got out to check the tire that had been slow leaking, and along the driver's side door, from the rear bumper to the front wheel well, someone had pressed 7 or 8 small stones into the mud caked on the truck's side panel, pressed them in. Carefully. In a line. I don't know when that happened. I don't know how. I haven't made that drive in the dark since. Story 2. The thing about night shifts at a remote toll booth is that nobody prepares you for how truly empty the world feels at 3 in the morning. I don't mean empty in a lonely way, though it is that too. I mean empty in the way that makes you realize how thin the line is between civilization and something else entirely. I worked a toll station on Route 9 up in northern New Hampshire for almost 2 years, and most nights were exactly what you'd expect. 18-wheelers, the occasional drunk coming back from somewhere he shouldn't have been, deer in the breakdown lane. It was dull work, and I was grateful for it at the time. I needed the hours, and I didn't mind the solitude. My booth was small, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, with a sliding window and a space heater that rattled when it kicked on. I kept a thermos of green tea going all night, a battered paperback I'd been working through for weeks, and a small radio tuned to a classical station out of Burlington that faded in and out depending on the weather. On clear nights it came in perfect. On stormy nights I'd lose it completely and the booth would go silent except for traffic noise and the rattle of the heater. This was a clear night. The radio was on. I'd started my shift at 10 and it was coming up on 3 when I noticed the headlights. There was a car sitting about 200 yards back in the approach lane, not moving. This happened occasionally. Someone would miss the cash lane and have to wave for a supervisor, or a car would stall. I watched it for a few minutes. The lights were on, but the car wasn't moving. No hazards, no horn. I radioed my supervisor, Donna, and mentioned it. She told me to give it another few minutes and see if they moved up, because we'd had issues with people trying to tailgate through without paying. About 5 minutes passed and the car still hadn't moved. I could see it clearly in the lane's overhead lights, a light gray or silver hatchback, older model, engine running from what I could tell because the exhaust was visible in the cold air. Then it moved forward, slowly. Slower than normal, like someone inching forward unsure of the brakes. It came up to my window and I slid it open. "Evening," I said, $6.50. No response. I leaned slightly to look in. The driver's seat was empty, so was the passenger seat, every seat. The car was running with no one in it. I'll admit my first thought was mechanical failure, something weird with the brakes and the incline of the approach, no ghost story required. But the car stopped precisely at my window, and the window on the driver's side, it was rolling down. Slowly, steadily, with no one turning the crank. I stepped back. This was a manual window, not power. Something was rolling it down from inside the car. Nothing came out of the open window. No arm, no sound. The car just sat there with its engine running and its driver's window rolled down and the empty seat visible in the glow of my booth light. I called Donna again. She drove out in her truck and we both stood a few feet from the car in the cold. We could see all the way through it. Nothing. She chalked it up to a teenager prank. Maybe they'd rigged something and bilayed before getting to the booth. Her voice was steady, but she didn't get closer than I did. We called for a tow. The car was registered to an address in Laconia, a man whose name I won't repeat here. We heard later through Donna that when they contacted the address, there was no answer and the house appeared unoccupied. She didn't give us any more details than that. I would have let it go, written it off as strange but explainable, except that the next night when I came in for my shift, I found my thermos. I'd left it in the booth the night before, a habit I had. It was sitting on the booth's little shelf exactly where I'd left it, but the lid was off, and inside the thermos, someone had placed a single smooth stone. The booth locks from the inside. I was the only one with the key. Donna asked me once, months later, if anything ever felt off to me about working nights. I told her about the thermos. She nodded slowly in a way that meant she already knew something she wasn't sharing. I got a daytime warehouse job that spring. Story 3. I should preface this by saying I drive for a living, so I'm not someone who's easily spooked by dark roads or weird weather or being alone at 2 in the morning. I've been doing long-haul routes for going on 11 years, and I've had my share of strange nights. A bobcat that crossed in front of me in Arkansas. Fog on the Kentucky border, so thick I was navigating by lane markers. But nothing that made me question the basic nature of the world I was driving through. That changed on a route through western Texas about 4 years back. It was late August. Brutal heat that doesn't break just because the sun goes down. I'd been on the road since noon out of El Paso, and I was heading northeast on a state road that cut through some of the most desolate scrubland you'll ever see outside of a fever dream. No streetlights. Stars so bright and dense they looked like spilled salt. I had my AC cranked and a styrofoam cup of gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder. I checked in with dispatch around 11. Nothing unusual. Estimated arrival around 4 a.m., which was fine. Somewhere past midnight, I caught something in my peripheral vision, just a shape at first, a darker shape against the dark scrubland to the right of the road. I didn't slow down. Out there you see shapes all the time, creosote bushes, cattle, the occasional roadside shrine with its little solar lantern. My mind files things like that and moves on, except the shape was moving, not running, not loping, walking, keeping perfect pace with my truck at 63 miles an hour. I took my foot off the gas. The shape slowed proportionally. I accelerated. It kept pace. I tried to look directly at it and the headlights didn't quite reach. It was running parallel to the road, maybe 20 yards into the scrubland where the light fell off. I could see it because it was pale, much paler than the brush, and taller than it had any right to be given how far away it was. My first genuine attempt at logic. It was a second vehicle on a parallel ranch road, and because of the angles and the dark, the headlights weren't visible, but the truck's white cab was. That made sense to me for about 45 seconds, right up until I hit a section of road that curved slightly south and my headlights swept the scrubland in a full arc. No road, no vehicle, nothing out there but brush and distance. What I saw in that sweeping arc of light, I've tried to describe it to 2 people and I can tell they don't fully believe me, so I'll just say it plainly. The figure was running on all fours, not like a bear or a deer runs on all fours, like something that knew it should be upright but had made a temporary concession to speed. Its arms were too long. Even at a distance, the proportions were wrong, the limbs too extended, the gait too wide. It turned its face toward my headlights in that sweeping second, and I can tell you there was no face there. No distinguishing feature, just a pale oval of skin and the suggestion of a jaw. Then the arc completed and the road straightened and the shape was gone. I pushed the truck to 75. I have a rule about logging anything above 70 for insurance reasons, and I broke it for the next 40 miles without a second thought. I didn't stop. I didn't call dispatch. I turned the radio on loud and I drove. I pulled into a truck stop in Midland around 2:30, shaking in a way I wasn't willing to admit. I got out to do a walk around on the truck like I always do, checking the trailer connections, the tires. The right side of the cab from the front wheel well back to the edge of the sleeping compartment had been dragged with something. Long parallel scratches in the paint, deep enough to feel with your fingernail, starting and stopping at the exact height you'd expect from something running alongside at wheel height, reaching up. I filed a vandalism report in Midland, and the dispatcher at the yard told me it was probably a fence rail on the road edge. I agreed with him. I knew the marks weren't from a fence rail, but I agreed. I've requested the northeastern route since then. I'll drive all day if I need to. I don't do western Texas at night anymore. Story 4. My grandmother had this saying that I never fully understood until about 2 years ago. Some roads don't want to be used after dark. She grew up in rural Georgia, and she was full of small warnings like this, things that sounded like superstition until they didn't. I thought about that saying a lot during the winter after my divorce. When I was driving between 2 cities, I didn't want to be in for reasons I mostly didn't want to think about. I was making the trip every other weekend, about 4 hours each way, to keep up the visitation schedule with my daughter Priya. She was 6, and she deserved better than a father who couldn't keep things together, so I drove every other Friday night, regardless of weather, regardless of how I felt. One of those nights, the second Friday in February, I took a wrong turn. I know how that sounds. People don't take wrong turns on 4-hour routes they've been driving for months. But I'd been on a call with my sister for a stretch of it, and I must have followed the GPS off the highway when I shouldn't have, because when I came back to paying attention to the road, I was on a 2-lane county road I didn't recognize. Trees on both sides, so close their branches met overhead. No lights anywhere. The GPS was recalculating, the little spinner going around, which in my experience in rural areas means it had lost the satellite. I pulled over to let it find itself. This was maybe midnight. The temperature had dropped since I left, and there was a slick sheen on the road that I didn't love. I sat with the engine running and watched the GPS spinner and tried to figure out which direction I'd been heading when I turned off. That's when I heard the music. Faint, so faint I thought it was bleed from a radio station for a moment, but it was too sparse for that. Just a few notes repeating. Something that sounded like a child's music box, except not quite right. A note off-key in a way that made my teeth want to sit differently in my jaw. I turned my own radio off to hear it better, which I immediately regretted. It was coming from my right, from the trees. I told myself it was someone's house, set back from the road, maybe with a window open despite the cold, maybe with a kid who'd left a toy running. That was plausible. I tried hard to believe it, but there were no lights anywhere in that direction, and the sound had no building quality to it, no muffling. It sounded like it was in the open air, 50 yards into the woods. The GPS found its signal. I started to pull back onto the road. A child walked out of the trees. She was wearing a white nightgown and no shoes. She was maybe Priya's age. I keep coming back to that. 6 or 7, small, dark hair, walking with the kind of calm deliberateness that a child does not have at midnight in February on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. She walked to the center of the lane and stopped. Her arms were at her sides. She wasn't looking at me, or rather, she was facing me, but in the wash of my headlights, her eyes were closed. I put the truck in park. I'm a parent, you can't not. I got out and said, "Hey, sweetheart, are you okay? Are you lost?" She turned her face slightly toward my voice, still no eyes open. When she smiled, the smile went too wide. Not a monster smile, not the horror movie version. Just a smile that went too far to the side of her face, like her face hadn't done it quite right, like it was approximating. And she said in a voice that was too flat, too empty of childhood's particular music, "I know where you're going." I don't know what I did in the next 30 seconds. I remember being in my truck. I remember the door being closed. I remember looking back through the windshield and the road being empty. I drove. I found the highway and I drove. I called my grandmother when I got home. I told her the story in a rush, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Did it know your name?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "Then you're all right," she said, "for now." I don't know what she meant. I've thought about asking her to explain, but I keep deciding not to. Priya's music box broke that same week. The one on her nightstand that played a tune at bedtime. I picked it up and a note was off, identical to the one I'd heard from the trees. I replaced it immediately. I didn't tell her mother why. Story 5. There's a road that runs along the California coast. Not the famous one, not highway one where people take pictures with their convertibles, but a secondary route that dips inland and then back out, and on certain stretches at certain hours it goes completely dark. No traffic, no beachside towns, just bluff and scrub and the sound of the Pacific somewhere below you in the black. I moved to California from Wisconsin 3 years ago, and I spent the first year driving roads like this just to understand the scale of the place. I grew up in farmland. I wasn't prepared for how the coast felt, how the land seemed to just end abruptly, with nothing decided about it. That particular night, I'd been visiting a coworker named Ferris in a town about 60 miles north of where I lived. He'd had people over for a small thing, dinner, board games, the kind of low-key gathering that ends with everyone leaving around 11. I was the only one heading south, so I left alone. Good mood, full stomach, coffee in hand. The first 20 miles were straightforward, then the coast road narrowed and the phone signal dropped and I was in the dark stretch. I don't know exactly when I started noticing it, maybe 10 minutes in. There was, and I know how this sounds, a pressure change. Not dramatic, not a pop your ears change. More like the air in the car got heavier, the way a room feels when a window that's been cracked gets fully closed. I noticed it the way you notice a headache when it's just beginning to form, not yet a headache but the suggestion of one. And there was a smell, faint at first, like a tide pool, like brine and something organic, not unpleasant exactly but persistent. I thought maybe I was close to an inlet with low tide exposure. I kept driving. The car appeared around a bend in the road. An old station wagon pulled completely off the road onto a gravel turnout facing the bluff's edge. No lights. I slowed because the turnout was narrow and I was worried about clipping a bumper. As I crept past, my headlights illuminated the station wagon's interior for a moment. There was a person in the back seat, turned entirely backward, kneeling on the seat, facing out the rear window, a man older, completely still. He was staring at the road behind the car in the direction I'd come from, away from the bluff. His hands were flat against the rear window glass. I passed. I kept moving. I was trying to figure out the scenario that made that make sense, some kind of stargazing or wildlife watching situation, someone with an eccentric habit, a local I was misreading. It almost worked. I was almost convinced, except when I looked in my rearview mirror, the station wagon's headlights had turned on, and then the backup lights. The car was reversing out of the turnout onto the road behind me, not quickly, deliberately. It followed me for 3 miles before I got to a section of road with a streetlight and a cluster of buildings that constituted a town. When I pulled into a lit gas station, the station wagon slowed at the edge of the light, sat still for a moment, then turned around and went back the way it came. I sat at that gas station for 45 minutes with the car locked before I finished the drive home. I've tried to think about the man in the back seat, tried to understand what I saw. Here's what I can't get past. The brine smell in my car didn't go away when I drove away from the coast. It was still there when I got home. It was there the next morning when I opened the car door. When I checked, I found the floor mat on the passenger side was wet, not damp, wet with standing water in the grooves. The windows had been up all night. I sold the car 4 months later. The new owner asked why I was selling a car with that few miles on it. I told him it was a lifestyle change. He seemed satisfied with that. Story 6. The summer I turned 31, I agreed to drive my younger brother Declan home from a music festival about 200 miles from where we both lived. This was the kind of decision you make because it's family, and because the alternative is complicated, not because it makes logistical sense. He'd gone with a group, but the group had splintered, which, with Declan, was not surprising, and he'd burned through his phone battery and somehow ended up at the information tent at midnight asking if anyone was driving toward Portland. I'm not complaining about Declan in a mean way. He's one of my favorite people. He just has a gift for landing in situations that require rescue. I drove out to get him, arrived around 1 a.m., and we loaded his tent and his duffel into the back of my car and got on the road. He fell asleep within 15 minutes. Classic Declan. The route home took us up through a forested area near the Cascades, a stretch of road I'd driven twice before in daylight and never in the dark. It was fine at first. Nice, even. Cool air, empty road, a thermos of tea I'd made before I left and hadn't gotten into yet. Declan snoring gently in the passenger seat. Around 2:30 I passed through a small town, and I mean small, like a gas station and 4 buildings and a blinking yellow light. And on the far edge of town, where the road curved back into the trees, there was a telephone pole with something nailed to it. Not a sign, something white and bundled about the size of a pillowcase. I slowed because in the dark it looked for a moment like it might be an animal or something injured, but as I passed I could see it was just fabric, roped to the pole with what looked like cord. Weird, I thought, probably a property marker or a trail marker of some kind. I kept going. About a mile later, another pole. Same bundle, same rope. I looked at Declan, who was still asleep. I noted it but didn't say anything to him because he was unconscious. 3 poles total over the next 2 miles, then nothing. Then the 4th thing, which was not on a pole. It was standing in the road, not in the sense of blocking the road, in the sense of standing precisely in the center of the yellow dividing line, about 150 feet ahead of me. I hit the brakes hard enough that Declan woke up saying, What in that half-conscious way? There's something in the road, I said. We both looked. In my headlights I could see it clearly enough. A person facing away from us wearing something pale and long, standing on the center line, not moving. Someone need help, Declan said, already more awake. I don't know. I had the car in park. I'm not going up to it. Why not? It's a person, Nadia. Just look at it. We watched. It stood completely still. No wind-shifted clothing, no natural human sway. The stillness of something placed, not something standing. Its arms, I couldn't tell how long they were because they were covered, but the fabric around them hung wrong, like the mass inside was distributed unevenly. Declan opened his door. I grabbed his arm. He looked at me and saw something in my face that made him close it again. For about 2 minutes we sat there, my engine running, this thing standing in the center of the road ahead of us. And then it stepped off the center line, not to either shoulder, but stepped off as if moving downward and was simply not there. No sound, no motion. It stepped off the center line and ceased to be standing there. We drove through that spot in silence. Declan looked at the road as we passed over it and said nothing. He's talked about it once since then, and only obliquely. He asked me if I thought the bundles on the poles were connected. I said I thought they were. He nodded like I'd confirmed something, and didn't bring it up again. 3 days after we got home, Declan found a length of cord in the back seat of my car. The same type as the rope on the poles. Neither of us owned anything like it. Neither of us put it there. Story 7. I was 17 when this happened, and I've spent a lot of time over the past 12 years trying to decide if 17-year-old me was reliable. I've gone back and forth. Some days I think I was sharp, observant, not prone to inventing things. Other days I remember how tired I was, how bad my night vision was before I got glasses, and I almost let myself off the hook. Then I remember the hat, and I stopped trying to rationalize it. I grew up outside a small town in Missouri, flat country, big sky. The kind of place where there are 3 roads out and you know all of them before you're old enough to have your license. I'd been driving legally for about 4 months when my friend Jessamine asked if I'd come with her to pick up her cousin from a party about 30 miles out. She didn't have her license yet. I said yes because Jessamine was one of those people I couldn't easily say no to. She had a way of making things sound sensible until they were already happening. We left around 11. Her cousin's party was at a property down a county road about 8 miles off the main highway, someone's parents' acreage, the kind of outdoor party that happens in the fall before it gets too cold. We found it fine, picked up her cousin Orrin, who was about our age and had the decency to be sober. We started back. The county road that led back to the highway passed through a section that everyone locally called the Cut, a long, low stretch where the road dipped between 2 raised fields, so that the land on either side was about 6 feet above road level, and the whole thing felt like driving through a shallow trench. During the day, it was unremarkable. At night, it was the kind of place where your headlights only showed you about 30 feet ahead before the road curved, and the field edges were close enough that the whole world narrowed down to just the lane in front of you. We were in the middle of the cut when the figure dropped from the right field edge. I say dropped because that's how it happened. It dropped from the elevated field onto the road about 20 feet in front of us and landed wrong, too hard for the knees, like someone who hadn't judged the fall correctly, coming down awkwardly and catching itself with one hand. I hit the brakes hard. All 3 of us lurched forward, standing up from that crouch, and it was slow about it, deliberate, like getting to its feet was an act of decision rather than reflex, was something that looked at first glance like an older man, dark clothing, very tall, or it seemed tall because we were low in the car. It straightened up completely and stood in the beam of my headlights and turned to face the car. No face. That's not quite right. There was a face, there were the appropriate places for features, the hills and hollows of cheekbones and eye sockets and jaw, but they were wrong. Compressed is the word I keep using. Like someone had pressed gently but firmly on all the features from both sides, not hard enough to destroy them but enough to change the scale. The nose too flat, the mouth too thin, the eyes too close together and too small, so that the whole face read as a face only because of the arrangement, not because any individual part was right. It was wearing a hat, an old-fashioned hat, like what my grandfather wore to church in the one photograph we have of him, a dark fedora, and the hat was on right, properly brim level. That detail has never left me. The hat was on right. Jessamine said go in a very quiet voice, and I was already moving. I didn't speed through the rest of the cut. I couldn't the curves. I drove as fast as I dared, and I watched the left field edge the whole time, waiting to see it drop from that side too. It didn't. We made the highway and I drove us home without speaking much. Orrin threw up in the parking lot when we dropped him off, which I've always felt was the reasonable response. A week later, Jessamine's mom asked who had borrowed her husband's old fedora from the hall closet. It had been put back, she said, but it had mud on the brim. No one in the house had touched it. Story 8. This past winter was the first time I'd driven through Idaho in December, which tells you something about my judgment. I'm from Atlanta originally, which means my relationship with winter driving is theoretical at best. I was relocating, very slowly, in a car stuffed with whatever didn't fit in the moving pod, to a position in Boise, and I'd underestimated the mountains. By the time I hit the stretch between Twin Falls and Mountain Home, it was past midnight and I was fighting snow that the weather app had promised wouldn't arrive until Thursday. It was Tuesday. I should have stopped. There were 2 chain-up areas early on where I could have pulled over and waited it out or found a motel. I kept going because I'd been driving for 9 hours and my brain was doing that thing where continuing feels more achievable than stopping. The road was passable. Not good, but passable. I had the heat on high and a podcast I wasn't really listening to, and the particular focused tunnel vision of someone who is slightly too confident. The snow thickened around 1 a.m. and I slowed to 30. The road was mine alone, no headlights ahead, nothing in the rear view, just the white coming down in the cones of my headlights and the dark on both sides. High desert, sagebrush half buried, the occasional fence post. Sparse and flat, nothing like the mountain passes I'd worried about. This was the long, flat approach. About 2 miles past a small turnout, I saw lights, not headlights, a yellowish glow off to the right side of the road, too low to be a building, more like a light set at ground level or close to it. Amber-colored, steady, not flickering. I slowed further and let myself look at it as I passed, trying to figure out what it was. It was a lantern. Old style, the kind with a glass panel and a burning wick inside. Sitting on a fence post at the edge of the road, the orange light steady inside the glass. In a snowstorm, at 1 in the morning, in the high desert, I passed it and drove another 1/4 mile and then sat with my foot on the brake for a moment too long because something about it had hooked in me. The lantern meant someone was out there, in this. And either they needed help or they'd placed it deliberately for someone specific, and both of those things seemed worth understanding. I reversed slowly back to the post. The lantern was still there, burning. I rolled down my window and the cold hit me immediately, and through the cold came a sound very faint coming from out in the sagebrush to the right, a rhythmic sound. At first I thought it was a tool, something mechanical. Then I realized it was too irregular for that. It had the cadence of breathing, very slow, very large breathing, the kind of inhalation-pause-exhalation pattern that suggested something enormous taking its time. I sat in my car with the window down and listened to whatever was breathing in the sagebrush in the dark and the snow, and I understood somewhere below language that I was near something, that the lantern wasn't placed for me but I'd stopped anyway, and stopping was the problem. Something shifted in the brush. Not crashing, not running, a weight shift, the sound of something large reorienting itself, turning. The breathing, if that's what it was, grew slightly louder. I rolled up my window and drove. I don't know what the lantern was for. I've tried to think of reasonable explanations, property marker, road safety, someone's strange habit, and none of them hold up when I try to put them next to the sound. The two things together don't resolve into anything comfortable. When I stopped at a gas station in Mountain Home at 2 a.m., I found my passenger side mirror had been adjusted, angled down and outward, pointing at the ground alongside the car. Not inward the way wind or a bump might push it, deliberately down and out, as if someone had taken the time to position it to reflect the ground right next to the door. I don't know what it was looking at. I'm glad I don't know. Story 9. My mother's family is from a part of Louisiana where the backroads don't always show up on maps. Not because they're secret, just because cartographers made choices about what mattered, and some of those roads didn't make the cut. They've been there for generations, connecting properties and parishes in ways that only the people who grew up on them really know. I didn't grow up there, I grew up in Memphis, but I visited every summer until I was about 15, and I knew those roads well enough to think I could navigate them without GPS. The night in question, I was 28 and I'd driven down for my great-aunt Celestine's 90th birthday. Big family gathering, the kind that starts in the afternoon and doesn't fully end until the following morning for certain stubborn uncles. I left around 2 a.m., which felt reasonable at the time. I'd slept a few hours in a guest room and I had a 6-hour drive back to Memphis, and I wanted to get ahead of the morning traffic outside of Baton Rouge. I took the back way out of the parish. I don't know why exactly. I think I was nostalgic. I wanted to go past the pond where I used to fish with my cousins Thelma and Ray, past the burned-out sugar mill that we'd been told 100 times not to approach. The back way felt like a goodbye to a place I wouldn't see for another year or two. Everything was fine for the first 20 minutes. The night was warm and wet the way Louisiana nights are in September, and the road was exactly as I remembered it, smooth in some places, badly patched in others, with the vegetation pressing close from both sides and the occasional cypress reaching over from a low area to the right. I had my windows cracked. I could hear frogs and the distant sound of something large in the water, probably an alligator. Then the road changed. I know that sounds dramatic, but I mean it literally. The road I was on passed through an intersection I remembered, then continued along the fence line of a property that should have been open pasture on the left, but instead of pasture there were trees. Old trees close together, which is impossible on a road I'd driven a dozen times, and the road itself had a texture that was different, rougher, narrower, the gravel mixed off somehow. I stopped and looked at my phone. No signal, GPS spinning. I tried to retrace my turns mentally and couldn't find where I'd gone wrong. The intersection I remembered, the one with the rusted cattle gate, I'd gone straight through it, same as always. The road shouldn't have changed. I sat there for a moment and the frogs were different. I registered this before I could articulate it. The sound was different. Not quieter, not louder, but wrong in pitch, like a recording played slightly too fast. My headlights illuminated maybe 60 feet of road ahead before the trees closed in. In that 60 feet, I could see that the road ended. Not at another intersection, not at a gate, it simply ended at what appeared to be a wall of Spanish moss hanging so thick it looked solid. I was doing a 3-point turn when I heard the knocking. 3 knocks on my rear passenger window, even spaced, deliberate, not scratching, not pounding, 3 measured knocks like someone politely requesting entry. I finished the 3-point turn without looking at the window. I know that sounds like cowardice. I've made my peace with it. Whatever or whoever was in this place that didn't exist on any map I knew, knocking on my window in the dark at 2:30 in the morning. I made the decision without deliberation that I was not going to look. I drove. The trees thinned after about a mile and I hit a road I recognized. I found the highway inside of 10 minutes and I drove north with every light in the car on and the radio as loud as it would go. I told my cousin Thelma about it 2 days later, describing the trees and the changed road and the moss wall. She went quiet in a way that told me she knew exactly what I meant. "Did you answer the door?" she asked. I said I didn't. She said, "Good," and then changed the subject cleanly and thoroughly, the way people do when they're done talking about something. I've asked her twice since then to tell me what she knows, and she says there's nothing to tell. I know that's not true, but she grew up on those roads and I didn't, and maybe she's earned the right to decide what gets passed on. What I know for certain is this. I have 4 knuckles on my right hand that are skinned raw, healing, in a photograph from the morning after that drive. I'm looking down at them in the photo with an expression I don't recognize on my own face. I have no memory of how they got that way, and I have no memory of taking the photograph. My phone took it automatically, some kind of motion detect feature I'd never set up. Some questions I've decided not to push on. This is one of them. Thanks for watching and for making it all the way through tonight's stories. If something in there got under your skin, if you're maybe a little less comfortable about your next late drive than you were an hour ago, then we did our job right. Hit that like button if you enjoyed it, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop a comment telling me which story stuck with you the most. I always read them, and sometimes the comments are almost as unsettling as the stories themselves. Share this with someone who needs a reason to keep the lights on tonight. Until next time, drive safe. and maybe don't stop for anything you can't explain.